Right, let's carry on then. Okay, today we have the pleasure of, after our break, Özge will give a presentation to us, so you don't have to listen to me for the next few hours entirely. But before then, before our break, I will introduce our topic and say a few words in general, and then start being specific, and I may have to finish after the break before Özge's presentation. So what we're looking at here is roughly the period from round about 400 perhaps to round about 600, the 5th and 6th centuries AD. And in particular, we're going to look at the demographic, the population movements of this period. And we'll begin thinking about how these population movements impact on the culture and the politics of the British Isles of Britain and Ireland during this time. And next week and the week after, we will focus more on the political geography of Britain and then on the political geography of pre-Viking Ireland, and follow some of these points and ideas to their fuller conclusion, I hope. What we're going to be looking at today from a number of angles and perspectives are these coloured arrows which I've put on the diagram here. So, most famously perhaps, the red arrows indicate the movement from northern Germany and southern parts of Scandinavia, Denmark, of Germanic-speaking peoples, Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, and probably some others, okay, into the southern and eastern parts of what is now England, the beginning of the process of creating England, Ingilterra, as opposed to Britannia, I suppose. And that's going on during this period. In addition, we have the green arrows, which indicate the movement of Irish, Celtic-speaking peoples from the island of Ireland into parts of Britain, to some extent into southern and western Wales, and a little bit down into southwest Britain as well, and most significantly into western Isles of Scotland, where they create the beginnings of what becomes Scotland, in fact. Okay, I'll explain that perhaps on Tuesday. And then finally, we've got the movement, the black arrows down here, of people from the Britons, the P-Celtic people, and probably Latin-speaking people as well, from the southern parts of Britain into what is called Armorica, northwest France, which becomes Brittany. Okay, and we'll have examined that in due course. I haven't prepared a PowerPoint show today for this topic, because most of what I'm going to do will involve maps. So we'll be looking at a lot of these maps. So I hope it's kind of clear and focused enough so that you can see what we're doing. Okay. And next week and the week after, as I said, we will focus more on the individual names of these little kingdoms that emerge during the 6th and 7th centuries. Today we'll look at the more general, broader, as I said, population movements, rather than looking at the political side in great detail. So we'll shift over to that as we go along. Okay, we touched briefly on late medieval, late Roman Britain last week, and we talked about some of the issues of the decline. We talked in particular about the important, or allegedly important, dates around about 408, 409, and 4010, when we have some kind of expulsion of Roman administrators from Britannia and parts of Britain, and then a letter which indicates that the Britons had requested help from the Romans, but the emperor is writing back saying, sorry, we're a little bit busy down here with our own problems, we can't really send any more troops up to you, you're on your own, boys, putting it in a rather crude way. And what else was going on, of course, is hard to tell. These are just little snippets from documents which have survived, and we tend to build up a whole kind of picture from these individual surviving references, and I'm sure the whole thing was a lot more complicated and a lot more detailed than we can ever kind of reach. But during this time, we see the at some point by about 400 and in the following decade, officially, technically, Britain ceases to be part of the Roman Empire for all intents and purposes, and the British have to look to themselves and gradually create alternative forms of political community, of polity and so on, which emerge as individual kingdoms. And during this same period, we see the increase in the movement of Germanic peoples into the south and east, as we said, creating their own forms of government as they settle into Britain. So the whole picture is gradually changing. So our old image from last week, 2nd century Britain, nicely broken down into civitas and with all the nice urban areas and so on, disintegrates to some extent, and we get the emergence of a rather different but not entirely distinct political picture here. Okay, there is a level of continuity and so on. Again, we mentioned before, I think Kent could be seen as kind of continuing Roman and even pre-Roman kind of forms of association or something like that. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the primary sources briefly, and then look at some of these things in detail. I know that Özge is going to talk a bit about these as well, but there's nothing wrong with repeating ourselves. The BBC have been repeating television programs for decades, and they're still successful. In terms of documents, in terms of studying this very, very dark period, the sub-Roman period, the period from the end of Roman rule until we kind of begin to see something emerging more distinctly in the late 6th and early 7th centuries in Britain, we have a number of different sources that will help us do this. We'll have a look at some of the documents shortly. We were referring to a number of these. I won't go into the details now, but we have, for example, a religious text generally known as the On the Ruin of Britain by a Welsh or British priest called Gildas. Later on, once the English are settled in and we have kingdoms emerging, including up in the north here, an English monk called Bede writes the first real true example of English history writing, the ecclesiastical history of the English people. And that's an important source not only for English but for Welsh history as well. But obviously he's writing from a much later perspective. The Anglo-Saxons continue processing this information. We get the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which we'll look at, which gives specific dates to events into this dark period, and we'll discuss the validity of that, and I think Özge is going to say a bit about that as well. These sources, a bit like the references, earlier references to specific dates here, they give kind of snapshots, often from a rather retrospective later viewpoint. But they certainly don't give the they certainly don't give the full picture, and that's why historians, scholars of this period find themselves more than other historians using what we might call auxiliary disciplines, but the scholars of those disciplines might not wish to be known as auxiliary, which means sort of supporting. And again, I think Hava will say, Özge will say, sorry, I keep calling you by your other name, we'll mention these as well. But as we said last week, you can study this kind of period using, for example, linguistics, studying language. And from within the linguistic framework, you can use names of all sorts, personal and place names, to study that. And we did a bit of that last week, and we'll do more of that this week and on Tuesday, in fact. Archaeology, obviously very, very important. The things that people left behind before they died and become submerged under the ground and now dug up reveal a lot about their lifestyle, their culture and their connections and things like that. And not today, but on Tuesday, we shall discuss those three, in fact, articles I asked you to look at, which are examples of what's sometimes called genetic archaeology or genomic archaeology or something like this, which is using modern day DNA, genetic evidence, to try and understand population patterns and movements a long time in the past. Now, did you all have a chance? We're not going to do it today, so don't panic. But if you haven't done for Tuesday, you've got the references on the bibliography sheets, so try and print those things out And as we learned from Chara's example, one or two of them are only accessible from within the Bill Kent network. So,
First two sources.
right, the first two. Okay, so if you live outside of campus and you don't have your VPN access to the network or something, you'll need to come into the university and print in the labs or something like that.
David, it's so difficult to send the access of the articles. Maybe, I'm not sure, maybe will be at home. So just the link, will it be difficult for you?
You mean the link, or, I mean, I can, you mean just copy the links from my, so that you don't have to type in the PDF, you mean? Or what?
No, can you send us the PDF?
Oh, I say it's an attachment. Okay.
As attachment.
Yeah, okay, we can do that, as long as we're not breaking copyright law. I better check and get my librarians to check on that one. I can't announce that to the world. What?
Just need to print out what? What are we doing for next Tuesday?
You don't remember from last week? You've got the Biblio. Okay, yeah, it was holiday time. Right, okay, somewhere here you have this.
Oh, and you wanted us
To read 3 articles.
Okay,
They're
yeah.
all scientific ones. So in fact, as I explained last time, you'll read the first 2 pages and understand it, and you'll read the last 2 pages, and all the stuff in the middle will be completely kind of technical gobbledygook or whatever, unless of course you're budding geneticists or something. But so that's why I gave 3 rather than 1, because in fact I'm not expecting you to spend too much time analysing the tables of haplogroups and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, okay, I'll try and remember to.
I have the same problem at home.
Yeah, okay, I'll send okay, who needs these as attachments, as long as I can do this legally, okay?
I mean, if you can do it.
If I can do it, I'll get my librarians to double check on the sort of legal side of this, obviously. Oh, yeah, you've done it already, okay. I mean, I can probably send, I think from STARS, I can log on, I've got all your emails there, and then I can probably make attachments, so I can do it that way, okay? So,
Where can, if you attach it as a PDF, where can we get it printed? Because I've tried to put a PDF like on an external hard drive to the photo place, and they won't print PDF.
you mean in the, what,
In the library.
in the library, right, oh.
They told me that they can only print like Word files, they wouldn't print a PDF for some reason.
I don't know about that. I'll have to ask about that. Check with the user services manager why that's the case. He's a Turk, but he doesn't speak great Turkish. He's working on it, okay? We've got labs.
It's a PDF. Okay. I tried to take a PDF there. and
Sorry,
it didn't
baby.
let me.
Sorry.
It's okay. No.
Okay, I'll try it again.
Well, if there's a problem in the library, you can always run upstairs and say, "Hey, David, what's going on?" And I'll get someone to help you. Or if you say, "I'm David's student," then they'll all go, "Oh," I think so. Yeah, okay, but okay, maybe. Okay, Özge, send me an email. You know me, I forget everything. Send me an email, remind me, and then maybe at some point tomorrow I can. I'll remember to take one of these. I can either go to the history office where I've got the link, or I'll do it from the library and I'll send it. Okay, by that way. So, I've even forgotten where we're up to now. Okay, yes. So even genetic material can help give a picture. Modern genetic material and other kinds of genetic material can help us reach back into the past. Okay, let's have a look at 3 documents now. We'll read through these and get an impression of what historians work with and what they can say and perhaps what they can't say. Good, okay. This is from the text called The Ruin of Britain by Gildas, who was a British, or some would say Welsh, because they're in the process of becoming Welsh, I suppose, but late Romano Britain, or very post-Romano Britain, I should say. There are various attempts to try and decide exactly where he was living and so on. I don't think I'm convinced by any of these things. We just have to say that he was somewhere in central or western or northern Britain, where the Welsh was still in control at that time. Okay, this text is a religious text. It's a kind of sermon. Okay, like priests give on Sundays at churches, but it's got a certain amount of historical information in it. What he's trying to do in this text is he's trying to point out to the British people, the Welsh, or proto-Welsh if you want to call them at this stage, that the English have come and they're taking over Britain, and it's the fault of the Britons. They've been kind of bad boys and girls, they've gone away from God's way and so on, and now God has allowed these terrible Saxons in and they're taking over and so on. And obviously he's picking up on traditional biblical themes and the ways that the Hebrew history was presented in the Old Testament and so on. Okay, so that's, he's on a continuity of tradition here. So let's read through what he's got to say here. And this is, in a sense, the only really, and it's not even contemporary, but it's the closest we've got to what we might call an account of the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. It's the closest we have. And then all the members of the council, together with the proud tyrant, who may be a guy called Vortigern. There's maybe a name play going on here, and in some copies of this the name is given, if I recall correctly. And then all the members of the council. So the British have got some, at least somewhere in Britain, it doesn't mean the whole of Britain, somewhere they've got some kind of concilium, some kind of organisation, together with the proud tyrant, some kind of leader. Okay? They were struck blind, which doesn't mean literally, it just means they were not seeing clearly, they weren't thinking clearly. The guard, or rather the method of destruction they devised for our land, was that of the ferocious Saxons, name not to be spoken, hated by man and God, should be let into the island like wolves into the fold, wolves into where the sheep are, to beat back the peoples of the north. So, the council and the proud tyrant, maybe Vortigern, or may not be him, decide to bring in Saxon mercenaries, okay, hired thugs to do the fighting for them, because the Romans have gone and obviously the British can't look after themselves. From the north of Britain, beyond Hadrian's Wall, the Picts, the people who occupy that area, have been attacking, sailing down and attacking Britain for a while, and so they're bringing in the Saxons, the English, as kind of mercenaries. Nothing more destructive, nothing more bitter has ever befallen the land. However utter the blindness of them, how utter the blindness of their minds, how desperate and crass the stupidity. Of their own free will they invited under the same roof a people whom they feared worse than death, even in their absence. And then the biblical references, the silly princes of Zoan, as has been said, giving foolish advice to Pharaoh. Then a pack of cubs burst forth from the lair of the barbarian lioness. This is all obviously imagery here, okay? This is referring to the Saxons. Coming in 3 keels, which is form of the ship, as they called warships in their language, which is interesting. So Gildas knows at least one English word. The winds were favourable to the omens and auguries, which prophesied, according to a sure portent among them, that they would live for 300 years in the land towards which their prows were directed, and that for half the time, 150 years, they would repeatedly lay it waste, and so on. On the orders of the ill-fated tyrant, blah, blah, we won't follow that through. But here is the account which Gildas gives, maybe 100, 150 years after the event, saying that somewhere in Britain they decided to invite in to allow Anglo-Saxon mercenaries, and we have archaeological evidence of these kind of people around earlier on. And if you go and look at the contemporary situation in Gaul, in France, and elsewhere in the Roman world, it's quite common to use Germanic soldiers as kind of confederates to fight for you and so on. So they're not doing something particularly odd in a sense, okay? But he's presenting it here as a negative thing. These stupid people let the bad guys in. And the Saxons had also been attacking southern Britain for quite a long time in the late Roman period as well. So they are letting in a dangerous bunch of guys. But this is very, very simple. He doesn't give us any real names. He doesn't, apart from the proud tyrant who may be Vortigern. He doesn't give dates or anything. It's all very loose because his purpose is to show how bad the British are and how their failure to follow God's way is causing these things to happen. His account is taken up subsequently by the English writer Bede. I'll put his name up for you as well. So let's say circa 550 for Gildas. Bede finished his book in 731. I'll have to move this now. Okay.
How, if this is written so long after the event occurred, I mean, not reliable, but how much substance does it really offer us if it's...
Well, potentially very little. We'll come back to that question in a minute.
I mean, it's like somebody 50 years from now writing an account of World War II and not actually, I don't know, it doesn't sound...
Yeah, but modern historians have got lots of contemporary accounts. We poor early medievalists have got very little to go on, so we have to snatch what we have. And people have written whole books about this kind of thing and different interpretations. So you're absolutely right. We're on very, very shaky ground. The writing of one Welsh monk in the middle of the probably in the middle of the 6th century, okay, which is then picked up upon by Bede and then followed up in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and they create a whole kind of thing from all of this. You know, we're obviously in very, very kind of dubious ground, how reliable the sources is and what we can say. That's why we have to use other sources, and even then, it's difficult to correlate these things. And we'll try and answer. We'll see if we can get it. We'll follow what we're doing here and see if we can get a fuller sense of your problem. I'm not going to say I'm going to give an answer. In the year of our Lord, 449, Marcian became emperor with Valentinian, the 46th in succession from Augustus, ruling for 7 years. In his time, so this is kind of vague, around about that time, he doesn't say in the year 449, but we're moving into more specific kind of structure here than we had with Gildas. In his time, the Angles or Saxons came to Britain at the invitation of King Vortigern, he specifically gives that name now, in 3 longships, and were granted lands in the eastern part of the island. And he's a little bit more geographically specific as well. On condition that they protected the country. Nevertheless, their real intention was to subdue it, was to take over Britain. They engaged the enemy, the Picts, advancing from the north, and having defeated them, sent back news of their success to the homeland, adding that the country was fertile and the Britons were cowardly. So these 3 ships worth of mercenaries, he's saying, okay, come, fight the northern Picts or whoever they are, and then encourage their cousins back on the continent to come over as well. Whereupon a larger fleet quickly came over with a great body of warriors, which, when joined to the original forces, constituted an invincible army. These also received from the Britons grants of land, where they could settle among them on condition they maintained the peace and security of the island against all the enemies in return for regular pay. And then there's a bit here that we're going to look at later on about these newcomers and so on. But this, you can see, is more or less what Gildas was saying, with a few more details and a few more kind of causal explanations mixed in. But largely, and if we had the Latin here, we would probably see some of the same words recurring. Bede had a copy of Gildas in front of him when he was reconstructing the advent of the Saxons, as we've got here. We enter into a very different situation when we come to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Get off the thing. Okay, 449 again. In this year, Mauritius and Valentinian obtained the kingdom and reigned for 7 years. Okay, that's again a kind of English way of referring to the Roman emperor and so on. In their days, Hengist and Horsa, invited by Vortigern, king of the Britons, now he's even called king, came to Britain at a place which is called Ebbsfleet, at first to help the Britons, but later they fought against them. The king ordered them to fight against the Picts, and they did so and had victory wherever it was. Then they sent to Angel, ordered them to send them more aid, and told of the worthlessness of the Britons and of the excellence of the land. They then sent them more aid, and so on and so on. Okay, then you get this thing about that we're going to look at later on. And then look here next, 455. In this year, Hengist and Horsa, so only 6 years later, fought against King Vortigern at a place which is called Aylesford, and his brother Horsa was slain. After that, Hengist succeeded to the kingdom and Ash, his son. In this year, 457, Hengist and Ash fought against the Britons at a place called Crayford, and there slew 4,000 men. The Britons then forsook Kent and fled to London in great terror. This is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was a much later document. A number of centuries later. Here is the edition from which we've got this. Drawing upon earlier material and earlier annals and chronicles, and as you can see here, legends as well. And we're into the 9th century and 10th centuries with the earliest extant versions of the chronicle, as far as I remember. So a long time later. Okay. What's the main difference between, if we compared this account with what we had, particularly with Gildas, the first of our accounts? What's the sort of big, obvious difference between them? I mean, it's not the detail, but in terms of the general style or presentation.
Like you said with Gildas, since it's more of a religious text, he uses a lot of illumination, whereas this is more, it leaves that out. It doesn't really go the religious route.
Right, there isn't this, yeah, okay, and obviously he had a purpose. He was British as opposed to English, so he had a purpose of kind of decrying, of going against the Anglo-Saxon arrival, and he had a religious interpretation of that. Also here, I mean, as we just tried to stress, we've got these dates, okay? Bede begins this process, but these guys are taking it further along. They're setting it up in a very clear and structured chronological framework, okay? And even into the 19th century and later, people would write history of 5th century Britain, and they would refer to these battles and give these dates, okay? And again, I think I'm anticipating a bit of what Özge is going to say, but but as I said, there's no harm in doing that a little bit. So clearly, we've got from one point, which is very vague, an account, to this very detailed, chronological, analytic account with names and dates of people and places very clearly set out. And it looks very nice, and it's very convenient, but for the most part, this is completely unreliable. Bede is more reliable, and Gildas perhaps even more reliable in terms of the information they give, because they don't give so much of this. This appears like Anglo-Saxon origin legends, the stories which the Anglo-Saxons might tell themselves as they sit round the fire in the dark days of winter. Where did we all come from? And they're telling these great stories about the Saxons and the Angles and so on. But it probably has very, very little historical value in detail. Who these people were exactly is hard to say. Okay. So to go back to Cengiz's point at the beginning, okay, the Gildas account seems very vague, and it's a little bit late anyway, so what substance is it? Then we get something much later, which has got more substance in it, but we probably have to reject it almost outright if we're going to be careful and thorough historians. So that leaves us with not a lot to go on, not a lot to play with at that point. First, I'll read a little bit from Bede again, the section that follows where we were reading before, and refer to this map, and we'll jump over to another map as well. These newcomers, the new people that arrived a bit later on, he says, were from the three most formidable races of Germania. It says Germany in my translation, but that obviously makes us think of the modern states, so I'll say Germania. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes. From the Jutes are descended the people of Kent and the Isle of Wight, and those in the province of the West Saxons opposite the Isle of Wight, who are called Jutes to this day. So he says people called Jutes settled in Kent, Isle of Wight, and somewhere around here. Okay. From the Saxons, that is the country known as the land of the Old Saxons, came the East, South, and West Saxons. East Saxons give the modern English place name Essex, South Saxons give Sussex, and the West Saxons give Wessex. If you know Thomas Hardy, you'll know all about Wessex, a different sort. And from the Angles, that is the country known as Angulus, which lies between the province of the Jutes and the Saxons, that's on the continent we're talking about here, is said to remain unpopulated to this day, are descended the East and Middle Angles, the Mercians, and all the Northumbrian stock, that is the people living north of the River Humber, and other English peoples. So he's primarily talking about these people here, as I put it in the green. Okay. So Bede gives us a kind of breakdown of how he perceives it round about 730 of the, we call it ethnic origins of the different English groups and so on. Jutes, Saxons and Angles living here. He tries also, as we saw, to indicate their place of origin on the continent. He talks about the Jutes, this is Jutland up here, and the Saxons, and then Angulus, the area in between. I've used green again and red in the coding pattern. Now, once again, we could be skeptical of all this. We could say, well, we're not really trusting a lot of these legends and so on, okay, and how can he be so specific, like perhaps 200 or more years after the event, and these are just origin legends and so on. But there is some supporting evidence, roughly, for this kind of breakdown that can help us get a picture of partly where these people were coming from to some extent. So, for example, archaeologists have studied various kinds of material remain. These are different kinds of brooch. We've called it brooch, but it's spelt brooch. I'm not sure what the difference is. And this was a thing used usually to hold your cape or something together. Okay, and some of them are quite simple and some of them are more complicated. And these ones called the cruciform, cross-shaped brooches, which have this kind of pattern here. Okay, these ones I've indicated green because both on the continent in parts of what is now Germany and Denmark, they are found primarily in the Jutish and Anglian areas, green marked there, whereas the different kind of brooch, circular ones that have the same purpose of keeping your things connected up, okay, are found primarily in the Saxon areas, the red area here, and it's the same to a large extent in Britain. The same kinds of brooches are found, different kind of brooches are found in Britain, and we find the cross ones in the, I don't know exactly where they are, but the cross ones are usually in the Anglian areas and the circular ones are in the Saxon, my red areas there, okay, and for this early period we're obviously talking more around about here, we're not talking right up here. Same for ceramics, for pottery. Here are examples of Anglian pottery, and they see, archaeologists identify a clear typological difference, a difference in style between these ones and these, what they call Saxon pots here. They can see there are differences between them, and once again we set more or less the same correlation. The same kinds of pottery are used in the Saxon parts of Britain and the Saxon parts of the continent, and the same, but the other kind of pottery is primarily found in the Anglian areas there. And it more or less fits, not 100% I don't think, but it more or less fits what Bede was saying, that the English are settled from these kind of peoples here. Now, elsewhere in his book, he mentions the Frisians, okay, which you may or may not be able to read. Frisians occupying, still living today, there are Frisians living in what is primarily Holland, the Netherlands, and The Frisian language is, in fact, the closest language in Europe to English. It's closer than German or Dutch. Okay? And linguists have therefore said that they were connected at one point. And some linguists also argue that Old Saxon should be part of this. Sometimes it's called Anglo-Frisian, sometimes it's called the Northwest Germanic group or something like that. Okay? But in terms of language change and language similarities, the Old English language of the Anglo-Saxons, and modern English to some extent, is close to the Frisian and to some extent perhaps arguably to Old Saxon as well. So linguistically we seem to be looking at this area, and they get mentioned a little bit in the historical sources. Okay? And Frisian pottery and brooches I think are a little bit more mixed if I remember. But also we've got to talk about these areas as well. So we can use archaeological evidence with or even without historical material, without the details that historical sources give, to try and work out roughly perhaps where people are coming from. Except, what was the problem, what was the interpretation problem that we discussed last week? A question of methodology here, of interpretation. What could this mean if we had our two maps? I can't put them both together. If we had our two maps here somehow like this, showing these two different greens and reds and so on, we're suggesting that these guys have gone to here, and these guys have gone here and here. What alternative interpretation of the archaeological Özge?
Maybe it can show us a migration from that place to that place, but also it can suggest us there was maybe trade between them, or a kind of interaction between the two societies. So we cannot be sure 100%.
Yeah, I mean, interaction is a good word. There's clearly some kind of interaction. It's unlikely that people in Britain woke up one morning and started making certain kinds of brooch that was very similar to the ones that are going on in the continent without some connection. That's not going to be happening, okay? There's no polygenetic explanation for this. They have to be connected. But what the nature of the connection is harder to say. And as we said, you can have movements of people bringing and carrying their clothing and so on with them from here to here. You can have exchange, the people in Britain saying, oh, they make lovely brooches, I want some of those, or something like that. Or you can have small numbers of people, elite groups, dominantly politically, who then dominate culturally, and then the British say, oh, we want to get on in the world, we better start wearing the Anglo-Saxon style brooches, or having those pots, or wearing certain kinds of belts and things like that. Okay? So again, the face of it may be quite simple, we've got a pattern, but exactly how you interpret that and what it means is more difficult. Okay? Bede presents it in one way, as a movement of people, and to some extent it must be, but exactly what that movement was and what the connections were are still perhaps open to debate. Okay? Languages we talked about, language movement and language change, also very important. I mean, you're all... Okay, Cengiz?
So can we say that these three groups are somewhat of a confederation, that they're considered separate but they don't fight with one another? Because if they're working together, why aren't they just one group?
Well, I don't think we can say very much about what they're doing or what they're thinking and things like that. I mean,
they're coming to England.
Britain. It's not England yet.
Britain. They're coming to Britain and they're fighting with the native peoples there, but they're not fighting amongst each other.
Well, they probably are as well. I'm sure they are. Okay. We've got on the one hand, we've got a very simplified picture of Anglo-Saxons coming in swarms, working together to remove the Britons and becoming English. And on the other hand, we've got probably the reality, which is a much more complex thing. And we're examining that slowly. So, yes, of course, these people would have fought against each other and had, on the continent as also in Britain, will have had rivalries and so on. And plenty of Saxon leaders were probably killed by Anglo leaders and others as they attempted to put themselves forward. So Bede presents it in a kind of, or to some extent Gildas, but B presented it. They wrote back to their friends back home and they all came over. I'm sure that didn't happen like that, okay? It wasn't quite that straightforward, but writers in the past tend to present these singular and very clear narratives and things like this. Now, I was going to say something about language and the Frisians. Let me just try and remember quickly what I was going to say. But yes, language change as well. You might say, well, if people are coming and they're speaking this language, and then they come here, and then there's more people speaking that language, that indicates, again, population movement. We're coming with our language, we replace the others, and we come and live there and bring our language. But again, culturally, language is a very shifty and flexible thing. For example, the people of where I come from, Wales, or the people of Ireland today, with a few exceptions, notable exceptions, in certain parts of those countries, most people who consider themselves to be Welsh or Irish, their native language is English. Okay? My mother didn't speak any English until she was 6 years old or something, but in my case, I called myself Welsh, but I learnt Welsh at school, but I didn't speak it at home with my parents and things like that. I'm not a perfect Welsh speaker. And it's the same for many people. So language doesn't indicate necessarily your ethnic or political affiliations in that sense. So it could be the same here, that elite groups can come and impose their language and as well as their culture, and people will shift, just as the Welsh and the Irish have undergone a shift of their language because of the elite power and control of the English in that sense. So even the interpretation of linguistic patterns doesn't necessarily indicate big movements of people one way or the other, perhaps. It's obviously, again, more complicated than that. Okay, that would bring us more or less, I think, to our discussion of the DNA topic, of the genetic issue. So we'll postpone that one till Tuesday's class. And again, all of you should read those 3 articles that I mentioned. And if you were not here last week, speak to me at the end and I'll give you the relevant bibliography.